Russia's President Vladimir Putin, who rules a country with the largest number of nuclear weapons, has repeatedly cautioned the West that any attack on Russia, including the 4 self-annexed territories in Ukraine, could provoke a nuclear response. Assessing whether or not Putin will resort to nuclear weapons is no easy task, but one thing is clear. The Russian special military operation in Ukraine is not going according to plan. Now, new and foreign weapons in the form of Iranian kamikaze drones have entered the battlefield, a clear indication that the dynamics are changing in this war of attrition. I'm Ali Janayandash, and I sit down with the former head of the CIA and retired 4-star Army General David Petraeus. This is One-on-One. General Petraeus, you've said before that you have to take Vladimir Putin's nuclear threat seriously. But I have to ask you at the same time, do you think that he's bluffing?
I think he is, but I'm not certain. And therefore, you do have to take it seriously. I think it's unlikely at this point in time that he would cross the nuclear threshold. The U.S. and other countries' leaders have communicated very clearly, both privately and publicly, that the response to this would be, in the words of the U.S. National Security Advisor, catastrophic. That is very serious. He would, if he used nuclear weapons, dig a deeper hole for himself than that in which he is currently finding himself. He's in a terrible position. Essentially, over the past 8 months, Ukraine has built a bigger and more capable army on its soil than Russia has there, and there's really nothing that Putin can do about this. The referendum at gunpoint was just not relevant. The annexation has been meaningless. The martial law that he's now declared will be similarly meaningless. And the partial mobilization has reportedly prompted more Russian men to leave the country than to go to the conscription stations. And those that have shown up or have been dragooned by the conscription offices are not exactly fit, well-trained, and they won't be well-equipped either. So they're the definition of cannon fodder.
Okay.
The reality is that Russia has lost in 8 months more than 3 times what it lost in 9 tough years in Afghanistan. So it's in a very difficult situation.
We'll get to the Russian position in just a bit, but I do want to press you on this issue, sir. I mean, in case Russia uses tactical nuclear weapons, you said that the U.S. leadership has called it catastrophic. You said that it cannot go unanswered. And a hypothetical that you had put forward was that NATO taking out every conventional force on the battlefield. That doesn't necessarily mean nuke for nuke, does it?
Not at all. And again, all I was doing was providing one possible option that is in a range of options that undoubtedly has been developed for policymakers in Washington and in other capitals of close allies. And this would not necessarily be a NATO operation. This would probably be a U.S.-led multinational operation. This is not about a NATO country. There's no Article 5 collective self-defense action here. This would be a response to a horrific decision by the Russian leader to use nuclear weapons. And as the U.S. National Security Advisor has said, the response would be catastrophic. Now, he has publicly stated that he has communicated this to his counterparts in the Kremlin. Other leaders have done likewise, both publicly and privately. And again, there's just a range of options that would also certainly include more economic and financial and personal sanctions and export controls. There would be diplomatic initiatives, and a host of other actions that would be in that range of options. One of those, as I mentioned, would be a conventional response led by the U.S. that could, again, dig that hole in which Russia finds itself even deeper by taking out Russian forces on Ukrainian soil and even perhaps taking out ships of the Black Sea Fleet as well.
Okay. I mean, you say that it doesn't necessarily have to be a NATO force. A multinational force is a possibility that you put forward. But the French president came out and said that his country would not respond with nuclear weapons should Russia use them in Ukraine. You have found these comments unfortunate. Where does it leave the strategic ambiguity of the West?
Well, I don't think that this is a case of strategic ambiguity. I think there's been strategic clarity. Again, the U.S. National Security Advisor has been very clear that the response would be catastrophic for Russia. That says a lot to me. That is obviously much more than just additional sanctions. That has to involve military action. And again, I tend to believe that it would be something led by the U.S. with other close allies and partners, and not necessarily going up the nuclear ladder of escalation. That would be in the range of options, certainly. And again, all I did was lay out in that Sunday show one possible option, which you have repeated here. And that certainly I would think would be on that menu from which a U.S. president and other allied leaders would choose.
General, one of the more interesting things that I came across on Russian state media earlier was their claim that there was already a nuclear bomb in Ukraine, specifically, I think, Mykolaiv, and that they would detonate it in order to blame Russia. And this would sort of be a pretext for U.S. or NATO or multinational forces to attack Russia. I mean, this is an awfully dangerous potential false flag operation.
Well, one of many. Everything that Russia has done since 2014 has been awfully dangerous. The unprovoked and literally barbaric at this point invasion of Ukraine and the operations there have been really catastrophic for Russia as well as for Ukraine. And now Russia finds itself where it's losing on the battlefield, and the only capability it has left is that which they can use to punish Ukraine. Missiles, rockets, some bombs, and of course now swarms of Iranian-provided drones that they've been using to target Ukraine's electrical generation and distribution capacity, and have taken out about 30% of that. Now the Ukrainians are incredibly resourceful, determined, and capable of restoring this capacity over time. But again, this is, also obviously a clear violation of the Geneva Convention, the law of land warfare. This is civilian infrastructure. This is not military forces that they're targeting. And they're doing it just because this is all that Putin has left at this point in time, recognizing, I think, as I mentioned earlier, that the use of nuclear weapons would cross a threshold that would be so significant that he would end up in a worse situation than he was before he used them. But again, that is something we have to take very seriously.
Today, it is Iranian kamikaze drones. Tomorrow, it could be some other weapon from another country. I mean, this could bring in Chinese weapons or more North Korean weapons into the battlefield. I mean, this could really change the tide in all this.
Well, the tide that matters most is on the battlefield, and that tide is ebbing for Russia. The Ukrainians are continuing to take back, to liberate parts of their country that were seized by Russia since 24 February, having already done so. First of all, of course, defeating the Russians in the battles of Kyiv, Chernihiv, and Sumy in the north, then liberating all of Kharkiv Oblast or province, now making inroads in Luhansk. At some point, you'll see further action in Donetsk in the south. And of course, they continue to creep forward in Kherson Oblast to liberate all of that territory, which is west of the Dnipro River, still occupied by the Russians, whose logistics and headquarters have been pushed back some 70 miles from the front lines, or 70 kilometers from the front lines, because of the very accurate rockets that the U.S. has provided for the HIMARS, the High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, the multiple launch rocket system that is a wheel-based. And that has been so devastating to Russian headquarters, barracks, fuel depots, ammo storage sites, and other locations, that it has degraded what were already inadequate logistics and command and control even farther. So the Russians are in a desperate situation where it matters most, and that is on the battlefield. And you mentioned Chinese weapons. I don't expect to see China violating the sanctions that have been imposed. China has not even unfrozen the $300 billion equivalent in foreign reserves that Russia has put there. So again, I don't think you'll see that happening. Perhaps something from North Korea. The Hermit Kingdom is already basically shut off from the world. But that's an indication of how desperate Russia is, that it has to go to these other pariah nations
Yeah.
because it's running out of its own rockets, missiles, bombs, and artillery, and it can't replenish them because of export controls and so forth. You know, reportedly, Russia has been buying washing machines just so they can take the microchips out of them
Hmm.
to use in their defense industry. That is not a particularly efficient way to make arms and ammunition.
I guess you would say desperate times calls for desperate measures. All right. As a military expert who spent most of their professional life serving your country at the very top levels, I mean, are you somewhat surprised by the performance of the Russian military? I mean, have they seems that they've not really lived up to their former glory?
To a degree, although I was one of the very few actually who before the invasion stated publicly in an interview in the Atlantic Journal that Russia would not take Kyiv, much less ever control it. And obviously that has been validated. That said, I think that I, along with virtually all others, thought that Russia had invested more in this much vaunted, talked about modernization of their military. That clearly was not the case. And then the sheer ineptitude has been stunning. The logistical inadequacies, the campaign design, the poor command and control. And then just on top of that, the lack of focus. And so Russia has had a very, very tough time. And meanwhile, Ukraine has done spectacularly. President Zelensky has turned out to be a Churchillian figure, providing extraordinary energy, inspiration, determination, and leadership. His military leaders have done likewise. And essentially, Ukraine has done vastly better than Russia in total mobilization. So now a country that is less than 1/3 the size of Russia has a larger military on the field
Yeah.
than does Russia because Ukraine has done vastly better at recruiting, training, equipping, organizing, and now employing forces.
Okay.
That is a stark reality for Russia, which has failed in those tasks compared to Ukraine.
General, you stated in that article to the Atlantic, you said that you didn't expect Russian forces to capture Kiev. What's behind the logic of Russia sending troops, I think, which stands around 10,000, to Belarus, which is very near Kiev, and they've called 300,000 as part of this partial mobilization? What's the logic behind there?
Well, I think that what is going on in Belarus is an effort to fix, if you will, to ensure that Ukraine has to maintain forces in the northern part of the country, again, to fix them there rather than allow them the freedom of action to go down to the southeast, or other areas where they'd like to employ them for counteroffensive operations. I find it very unlikely that Belarus would actually join Russia in attacking Ukraine from the north. I think their forces are even less capable, and that's saying a lot, than the Russian forces. This would be a debacle for them. In fact, Russia has already essentially been stripping the Belarusian forces of their armor, ammunition, and so forth to resupply Russian forces in the field, having to send it all the way around by rail, by the way, through Russia and then down. It was going across the Kerch Strait Bridge, which has now been damaged. So now it has to go on ferries to Crimea so that it can supply the Russian forces in the south. So again, I think it very unlikely that President Lukashenko would allow his forces to get dragged into this. He knows how inadequate they would prove to be. And the modest Russian forces that are there, I think, are there just to keep the Ukrainians from moving the forces in the north down to the south and employing them for counteroffensive operations.
General, under what scenario would or if the U.S. would send in actual boots on the ground?
I'm not sure I see a scenario in which U.S. would send in boots on the ground, frankly.
Okay. I mean, then would that include U.S. contractors to be sent in to stop the advance of Russian forces?
Again, I think that's very unlikely. We don't employ mercenaries the way the Wagner group, Russia's group that's headed by Prigozhin, a key Putin ally, does. Just not conceivable to me. We have lots of contractors, I'm sure, and those in uniform in neighboring countries that are helping to provide the arms, ammunition, and other material to our Ukrainian partners, and then ensuring the maintenance of it. If it goes down, as they say, it becomes inoperable. It's brought back out of the country, it's repaired, and then pushed back in. But the idea of contractors or boots on the ground, I just find very, very unlikely. There are, to be sure, some U.S. volunteers on the ground with nonprofit organizations and so forth, but I'm not aware of any large number that are there that are actually engaged in any kind of real fighting.
General, I want to sort of switch gears for a moment and actually talk about what's going on in Washington. The House Minority Leader recently said that there'll be sort of no blank checks for the Ukrainians if the Republicans win in the upcoming midterm elections, at a time when U.S. military aid is seen as sort of the driving force behind the Ukrainian counteroffensive. How devastating would it be if Kevin McCarthy spearheads this effort?
Well, keep in mind, we're in the final weeks of midterm elections. There's a lot said during that kind of period. He's clarified that and said all it means is there wouldn't be a blank check. There would be a check. Look, that check is already over $18 billion in just arms, ammunition, and other materiel, over $13 billion in economic assistance. I know that there are individuals, Senator Lindsey Graham publicly has stated that he wants to do another appropriations authorization during the period from the elections to the new Congress being sworn in, the so-called lame duck session. There is still very, very strong bipartisan support for Ukraine on Capitol Hill, in the administration, and in the United States. And I'm very confident we'll see the U.S. continue to lead the NATO and Western response to this unprovoked Russian invasion.
General, I mean, let's fast forward, I don't know, X years, X months after this conflict dies down. I mean, isn't there a real risk that Ukraine as a country basically or essentially turns into a garrison state at the end of all this? I mean, you have a military state, security state on the edge of Europe, on NATO's eastern flank, and this has got to be affecting long-term security challenge. I mean, $18 billion spent so far. This could be multiple times that when you look at it over a decade.
Well, I'm not sure I fully share that, but let me just say that what your question does highlight is the need for a security guarantee for Ukraine that likely would take the form of NATO membership. When this is all said and done, and it will at some point be brought to an end, there will have to be a durable agreement that is underwritten by a security guarantee. I can see no other viable security guarantee at this point in time than one that includes NATO membership. Look, we were sensitive to Putin's feelings about NATO membership in the past. How did that turn out? Not very well. They should be given a path to NATO membership. It's not a rubber stamp or guarantee, but that should be available to them. And I think that will be necessary. There will also necessarily be some kind of Marshall Plan for Ukraine to help rebuild the damaged infrastructure, revive the economy. But that will not succeed any more than the original Marshall Plan succeeded without a security guarantee. And it was the American security guarantee after World War II that was the critical element of that Marshall Plan's success, not the amount of money, it was the guarantee.
General, in the lead up to February 24th, Vladimir Putin was saying Ukraine joining NATO is an existential threat for us. And that's the line that they've actually kept on going from the very beginning. Ukraine is not an existential threat for the West. So it seems that the fight, or the size of the fight for Russia, is much larger for Vladimir Putin, is it not, when it comes to Ukraine membership?
Look, the world has turned many times since he said that. And again, our regard for his sensitivities did not pay off very well. And I think I would suggest that we need to do for Ukraine what we've done for the Baltic states. We have NATO forces there full time. And I think that that is certainly something we have to very seriously consider going forward. That's not the priority right now. The priority should be to help Ukraine liberate all of its territory from Russia so that it can revive its economy, so that it can repair its infrastructure, and so that it can have a durable security situation. But I think we're going to have to underwrite that in certain respects. And again, my suggestion would be to very seriously consider a path to NATO for Ukraine.
General, I have about a minute left with you. You say all of its territory needs to be liberated. So we're not talking 2014 lines. This includes Crimea, includes the entirety of Donbass. That's what the United States and the West wants.
I don't know what the United States and the West want. I know what the Ukrainians want. I'm obviously not in a government position. It is very clear to me, having engaged with Ukrainian ministers and military leaders and so forth at the Warsaw Security Forum 2 weeks ago, and then engaged with others in virtually more recently, that their definition of whole and free includes all of their country. That's what they are determined to liberate. I don't think President Zelensky could accept anything less than that in terms of domestic Ukrainian politics. We'll have to see how it plays out on the battlefield and whether their impressive operations can continue as they have in the past 2 months or so. But the reality facing Russia is that Ukraine now has a considerably better and larger military on Ukrainian soil than Russia has, and there is virtually nothing I can see that Putin can do about that.
General David Petraeus, appreciate your time. Thank you very much for speaking with us. Thank you.
Good to be with you. Thank you.